In May 2011, a few months before Steve Jobs would step down as Apple's CEO and less than half a year before he would die, Bill Gates drove out to Jobs' house in Palo Alto for a private visit. The two men, who had spent more than 3 decades locked in one of the most famous rivalries in the history of technology, sat together for hours. They talked about the past, they talked about their families, they talked about the future of computing, and about something that had quietly bothered both of them for years: how little all their combined innovation had actually done to transform education, compared to what technology had achieved in fields like medicine and law. By the time Gates left that day, something between the two men had shifted in a way that neither of them had ever fully explained in public, until Gates himself, years later, finally laid out exactly what had changed and why. To understand why that visit mattered so much, you have to go back to where this relationship actually started, because the warmth in that final year didn't come out of nowhere. It came at the end of nearly 40 years of two very different men circling each other, sometimes as partners, sometimes as bitter competitors, and almost always as two people who understood each other better than almost anyone else on the planet possibly could. Gates and Jobs first crossed paths in the late 1970s, when Microsoft was still a small software company writing programs for the Apple II. When Jobs began developing the original Macintosh in the early 1980s, he needed serious software partners, and Microsoft was one of the companies he turned to. Jobs flew up to Seattle to meet with Gates and pitched him on a vision that, at the time, sounded almost unbelievable: a computer designed for ordinary people, built around a friendly graphical interface instead of the command line screens most computer users were used to. Gates signed on, and Microsoft agreed to build graphical versions of a spreadsheet program that would eventually become Excel, a word processor that would become Word, and a version of the basic programming language for the new machine. For a while, this made Gates a frequent visitor to Apple's offices in Cupertino, where he watched Jobs manage his team with the same intensity and obsessive attention to detail that would define his entire career. Gates wasn't always impressed by what he saw. During those visits, by his own later account, he thought some of Apple's early graphical software demonstrations were underwhelming. But the two companies kept working together, and for a few years, Gates and Jobs had something closer to a professional partnership than a rivalry. That partnership fell apart dramatically in 1983, when Microsoft began developing its own graphical operating system, Windows, drawing heavily on the same kind of graphical interface concepts Jobs had shown off on the Macintosh. Jobs was furious. According to accounts from that period, when Gates visited Apple's offices to discuss it, Jobs confronted him directly in front of a room full of Apple employees, accusing Microsoft of stealing Apple's ideas. Gates, famously unbothered by the confrontation, pushed back with an argument he'd go on to repeat for years: that both companies had really borrowed the graphical interface concept from the same place, Xerox's Palo Alto Research Center, which had pioneered the idea years earlier and never fully commercialized it. In Gates's framing, Apple hadn't actually invented the graphical interface any more than Microsoft had. Both of them had taken the same idea from the same source and built their own version of it. That confrontation set the tone for a rivalry that would define both companies and both men for the next 2 decades. Windows became the dominant operating system on personal computers worldwide, while Apple struggled through a difficult period in the late 1980s and 1990s that eventually led to Jobs being pushed out of the company he'd co-founded, only to return in 1997 to rescue Apple from the brink of collapse. Throughout all of this, Gates and Jobs remained fierce, very public competitors, trading barbs in interviews, competing for market share, and representing, in the eyes of much of the tech industry and the media, two fundamentally different philosophies about how technology should be built. Gates stood for scale, licensing, and putting a computer on every desk running Microsoft software, no matter who made the hardware. Jobs stood for tightly controlled, beautifully designed products, where Apple owned every part of the experience. And yet, even during the most competitive years, there was always something more complicated underneath the rivalry than pure animosity. In a 1994 interview, years before their relationship would soften, Jobs described Gates in terms that, while not entirely flattering, weren't hostile either, acknowledging that Gates was fundamentally a decent, well-intentioned person, even while criticizing his taste and originality in other conversations. That mixture of respect and criticism ran in both directions for years. The two men clearly saw each other as serious, capable rivals worth taking seriously, even when they disagreed sharply about products, business strategy, or design philosophy. According to Walter Isaacson's biography of Jobs, published shortly after his death, this dynamic became especially clear in a joint interview the two men gave together in 2007 at the All Things Digital conference hosted by the Wall Street Journal. It was a rare, deliberately staged moment. Two of the most consequential rivals in tech history, sitting on the same stage, being interviewed together about their decades-long relationship. By most accounts, the appearance went well beyond a polite photo opportunity. Gates has since described that event as a turning point in how the two of them related to each other, saying that Jobs was warmer and more generous toward him during that appearance than he had been in years. It's worth pointing out that this wasn't actually the first time the two men had shown a flicker of public warmth toward each other, even during the height of their rivalry. Back in 1997, when Jobs had just returned to a struggling Apple and was trying to stabilize the company, he announced a surprising deal on stage at the Macworld Expo in Boston. Microsoft would invest $150 million in Apple and commit to continuing development of Microsoft Office for the Mac in exchange for a multi-year patent cross-licensing agreement between the two companies. Gates then appeared on a giant screen above the stage via a live video link to discuss the partnership directly with the audience. The reaction from the Apple faithful in the room was famously hostile, plenty of loud booing at the sight of Gates' face looming over Jobs, but the moment mattered enormously for Apple's survival, at a time when the company was genuinely at risk of running out of money. It's a useful reminder that even during the years when their rivalry looked most bitter from the outside, the two men were still capable of finding practical common ground when it actually mattered. That shift lines up with something else that was happening in Gates' life around the same period. In 2008, Gates formally stepped back from his day-to-day role at Microsoft to devote himself more fully to the philanthropic work of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, a transition he'd been gradually making since announcing his plans 2 years earlier. Gates has suggested that this change in his own life, moving away from being Jobs' most direct corporate competitor and toward a completely different kind of work focused on global health and poverty, helped soften the edge that had defined their relationship for so long. It's a small but telling detail. The two men's relationship didn't really begin to change until the competitive pressure that had defined it for decades started to ease. From that point forward, according to Gates' own later accounts, the two men spent meaningfully more time together than they had in years, even as Jobs' health began to decline. Jobs had first been diagnosed with a rare form of pancreatic cancer back in 2003, and after years of treatment, medical leaves, and a liver transplant in 2009, his condition began worsening again through 2010 and into 2011. Gates has said he spent a good amount of time with Jobs during that final year of his life, describing conversations that ranged far beyond business, touching on their wives, their families, and reflections on what all the technology they'd both spent their lives building had actually achieved, and what it hadn't. By early 2011, Jobs' condition had become serious enough that he took a medical leave from Apple, his third since his initial diagnosis, and made only a handful of public appearances that year. He stepped down as CEO in August 2011, handing the role to Tim Cook while remaining Apple's chairman, a decision that signaled to much of the outside world just how seriously his health had declined, even though Apple and Jobs himself kept most of the specific medical details private. Against that backdrop, the fact that Jobs made a point of spending several hours with Gates that spring stands out as a deliberate choice, made at a time when Jobs had very little energy or time left to spend on anything that didn't matter to him. That brings us back to the visit in May 2011. By that point, Jobs had already stepped back from most of his public appearances and was managing his health carefully while still serving as Apple's CEO. According to Isaacson's biography, Jobs made a point that spring of reaching out to specific people he wanted to see before he died, and Bill Gates was on that list. Gates drove to Jobs' home in Palo Alto, and the two of them talked for more than 3 hours. Jobs later told Isaacson that he was genuinely happy to see Gates that day, a detail that stands out given how combative their relationship had been for so much of their careers. According to Gates' own later description of that visit, the conversation ranged widely. They reminisced about the earliest years of the personal computer industry, when neither company had any idea how large this whole thing would eventually become. And they talked about something Gates has described as a shared frustration that despite everything computing had transformed, how people worked, communicated, and accessed information, it hadn't yet delivered anything close to the same kind of transformation in education. Two of the most influential technologists of their generation, sitting together near the end of one of their lives, comparing notes on what they still considered unfinished business. After that visit, Gates wrote Jobs a letter. He has described its contents only in broad terms in later interviews, that it was meant to tell Jobs he should feel proud of what he'd built, both in terms of the products Apple had created and the company itself. Gates has also said the letter touched on Jobs' children, whom Gates had gotten to know personally over the years, despite the first professional rivalry between their fathers. It was, by every account Gates has given since, a deeply personal letter, written by someone who understood exactly what Jobs had accomplished because he'd spent decades racing against him to accomplish similar things himself. Steve Jobs died on October 5th, 2011, at the age of 56, after his cancer had spread and his health declined rapidly in his final weeks. In the wave of tributes, retrospectives, and public mourning that followed, Walter Isaacson's authorized biography of Jobs was published just weeks later, offering an unusually candid look at his life, his relationships, and his famously difficult personality. The book included some sharp, unflattering comments Jobs had made about Gates over the years, including remarks suggesting Gates lacked imagination and would have benefited from a broader range of life experiences. Those comments generated headlines at the time, with plenty of coverage framing them as evidence that the old rivalry had never really healed. But that framing missed something important, which is exactly the detail that Gates would go on to reveal in later interviews, and the detail that gives this whole story its emotional center. Not long after the biography was published, Gates received a phone call from Lorene Powell Jobs, Steve's widow. She told Gates that despite what the book's sharper quotes might suggest, the biography hadn't actually captured the real depth of respect the two men had for each other by the end. And then she told him something that Gates has described, in multiple interviews since, as one of the most meaningful things anyone has ever told him, that the letter he'd written to Jobs after that final visit had meant so much, to Jobs that he kept it by his bedside for the rest of his life. That single detail is what makes this story so different from a simple, old rivals reconcile narrative. It wasn't just that Jobs said something nice about Gates in an interview, or that the two of them shook hands publicly at a conference. It was that, in the last months of his life, with everything else stripped away, Jobs chose to keep a private letter from Bill Gates close to him, right up until the end. In the years since, Gates has revisited this story in several major interviews, and the emotion in how he describes it has been hard to miss. In one particularly candid conversation, he grew visibly emotional while recalling that final visit, describing it as one of the most meaningful conversations of his life. He's talked about how strange and specific it felt to sit with someone who had shared the exact same improbable journey he had, building a company from nothing, becoming globally famous for it, and now facing the reality that none of that changes how mortality eventually works. Very few people on the planet could have understood what Jobs was going through in that specific way, and Gates, whatever their history, was one of them. That interview wasn't an isolated moment either. Around the same period, Gates sat down for a separate, extended conversation about his last meeting with Jobs, and the emotion came through there too, a rare crack in the composed, analytical public persona Gates has maintained through decades of interviews about business strategy and philanthropy. It's telling that out of everything Gates has been asked about across a career spanning the founding of Microsoft, the antitrust battles of the 1990s, and running the largest private foundation in the world, this particular memory is one of the few that has visibly moved him on camera, more than once, years apart. In the years since Jobs' death, Gates has talked about this period of their relationship in several interviews, gradually filling in more of the emotional picture. In one widely discussed conversation, Gates pushed back directly against the idea that there was ever some dramatic reconciliation that needed to happen between them at all. He's described their relationship in blunt terms, that there was no war to make peace from, no grievance requiring forgiveness. Instead, he's framed their entire rivalry, from the Xerox argument in the 1980s through decades of competing products, as something closer to two serious competitors, pushing each other to build better things, with the underlying respect intact the whole time, even when the public disagreements were sharp. That reframing is really the answer to the question at the center of this whole story. Why did Steve Jobs get kinder to Bill Gates right before he died? Based on everything Gates has said publicly since, the honest answer isn't that some rift finally healed. It's that the competitive pressure that had defined their relationship for most of their careers simply eased once Gates stepped away from Microsoft's daily operations. And once both men were forced, by circumstances neither of them could control, to confront what actually mattered to them at the end of their lives. Gates has described Jobs' illness and death as something that clarified his own thinking about what genuinely matters, a lesson that, by his own account, came directly out of watching a lifelong rival face mortality, and choosing, in his final year, to spend some of his limited remaining time with the person he'd spent decades competing against. It's also worth noting how consistent Gates has been about this explanation across nearly a decade of separate interviews, given to different outlets in different years, without any obvious reason to keep the story straight beyond it simply being true. In a 2013 conversation, he described the arc of their relationship almost like two people who had grown up alongside each other, despite spending most of that time as fierce business rivals. A year later, in a separate interview, he described their final conversations in more specific terms, reminiscing about their wives, discussing what technology had and hadn't managed to achieve, and reflecting on the sheer improbability of the industry they'd both helped build from nothing. The details shift slightly from one interview to the next, as memories naturally do, but the core of the story, the visit, the letter, the phone call from Lorene Powell Jobs, and the emotional weight Gates places on all of it has remained remarkably consistent every time he's told it. There's also something worth noting about how Gates has chosen to talk about all of this in the years since. He hasn't tried to rewrite the history of their rivalry into something softer or more sentimental than it actually was. In multiple interviews, he's been direct about the fact that they were fierce competitors for most of their careers, that Jobs said harsh things about him publicly and privately, and that their design philosophies and business strategies were often in direct conflict. But he's paired that honesty with an equally direct insistence that the competition itself was never really personal in the way outsiders often assumed. Gates has described their relationship as something closer to two people who grew up together in the same unprecedented moment in technology history, both close in age, both wildly ambitious, both building enormous companies out of nothing, and both aware, in a way almost nobody else on the planet could fully understand, of exactly what the other one was going through. That shared understanding is, in a lot of ways, the real explanation behind everything that happened in Jobs' final year. It's easy to assume that two of the most competitive men in the history of the tech industry only ever saw each other as threats. But by Gates' own account, what actually happened at the end was almost the opposite. With the competitive stakes gone, what was left was two men who had spent their entire adult lives inside the same extraordinary, unrepeatable moment in history, recognizing that almost nobody else could relate to what that had actually been like, the pressure, the ambition, the mistakes, and eventually the reckoning with mortality that neither of them could out-innovate their way past. Gates has said in later interviews that Jobs' death taught him something he continues to carry with him, a sharper sense of what actually deserves attention and time. Once you strip away the noise of daily competition and business pressure, it's a lesson that, by definition, could probably only have been fully understood by watching someone go through it. And there were very few people on Earth positioned to understand what Steve Jobs was going through in 2011, quite like Bill Gates was. There's a broader pattern here too, one that goes beyond just these two men specifically. Gates and Jobs weren't just business rivals in the ordinary sense. They were, for most of their working lives, two of maybe a handful of people on the planet who understood exactly what it meant to build a company from a garage or a dorm room into a global institution, to become a public symbol of an entire industry, and to have every product decision scrutinized by millions of people at once. Most executives, even successful ones, never experience anything close to that level of pressure or visibility. Gates and Jobs experienced it in parallel for decades, aimed directly at each other more often than not. It's not hard to see why, once the competitive stakes dropped away, what was left underneath wasn't animosity, but something closer to mutual recognition between two of the only people who could actually relate to what the other one had been through. That's also probably why Gates has never framed the end of their relationship as some kind of grand forgiveness narrative, even though that's the version of the story that tends to get repeated in headlines and retrospectives. Forgiveness implies there was a wrong that needed correcting. Gates' own account suggests something different, that the sharp public disagreements and blunt private comments were always just the visible surface of a much steadier, decades-long mutual respect underneath, one that simply had fewer opportunities to show itself while both men were still actively competing for the same customers, the same markets, and the same place in history. So when people ask why Jobs seemed to soften toward Gates in his final year, and why Gates has spoken about their relationship with such evident emotion in every interview since, the most honest answer isn't really about forgiveness or late-life apology or some dramatic reconciliation scene. It's simpler and in some ways more affecting than that. Two men who had spent nearly 4 decades defining an entire industry against each other finally had the space, right at the very end, to just be two people who understood each other, sitting together for a few hours in a house in Palo Alto, talking about their families, their regrets, and the parts of the future they both still hoped someone would eventually get right. It's worth remembering, too, just how unlikely this entire story actually is when you step back and look at it as a whole. These were two men who, for the better part of 4 decades, were held up by the press, by their own employees, and often by themselves as opposites. Gates, the calculating businessman; Jobs, the temperamental visionary; Gates, the licensing empire builder; Jobs, the closed ecosystem perfectionist. That framing sold a lot of magazine covers and fueled a lot of tech industry mythology, and there was real truth in it, but it also flattened two genuinely complicated people into cartoon versions of themselves, in a way that made the ending of their story, a private letter kept by a deathbed, hours of quiet conversation about family and unfinished dreams for education, almost impossible to predict from the outside. Maybe that's the real lesson buried in this whole story, beyond just the specific details of one visit and one letter. The public version of a rivalry, especially one this famous, is almost never the whole picture. Underneath the headlines, the product launches, and Decades of pointed quotes traded back and forth in interviews, there were two people who spent their entire adult lives inside the same improbable moment in history, and who, when it finally mattered most, chose to spend some of the very last hours available to one of them simply being honest with each other about what all of it had actually meant. If you found this story as moving as I did, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the personal history behind the biggest names in tech. And let me know in the comments, do you think their rivalry actually made both companies better? Or was decades of competition really just standing in the way of two people who understood each other more than anyone else around them?